Hello everyone, welcome to this evening's presentation of the Edinburgh Fortean Society. My name's Gordon Nutter and I organise these events. Normally we would meet on the second Tuesday of every month at 7:30 in a pub, usually the Beehive at the moment, and we would have a talk and a discussion. Obviously the current situation means we can't do that, so we're trying to keep the habit alive, if you like. So we're putting these videos up once a month, 7:30, second Tuesday of the month. Normally we wouldn't actually have an event during August because of the Edinburgh Fringe and Festival, but this year that's no longer an issue, so we're going to have only our second ever August event. Tonight we've got a speaker who's been a mainstay of the Edinburgh Fortean Society for a good few years now, and he's going to be talking on a spin-off of one of his favourite topics. So for tonight we have Scott Lyall talking on Beyond Bigfoot, America's Other Forgotten Apes.
Hello, I'm Scott Lyall, and tonight I'm going to be talking on Beyond Bigfoot, North America's Other Mystery Primates. So we're all familiar with Bigfoot, I assume, but just in case you're not, I'm going to run over what Bigfoot actually is before I look at other forms of mystery primates. So Bigfoot reported as being large, hairy creatures, usually sighted in the Pacific Northwest of America. That's the area from California, Northern California, up to Alaska, but they're reported right across the continent. So from Alaska through to the southeast, places like Texas, Florida, Oklahoma, not necessarily areas that you would automatically associate with them, but these areas also have a rich amount of sightings. So the creatures are usually described as being tall, around about 7 to 8 foot, sometimes a bit under, sometimes taller. They're bulky, powerfully built. Their hair is usually described as being dark, so black, brown, or red, but white, grey, and blonde are also reported. So that's effectively the same sort of spread of hair colours you would get in human beings. And their necks are described as being short and thick, or sometimes totally absent, so sometimes described like the head sits immediately on their shoulders. They're described as being flat faced, that is in the same way that sort of humans are, without a snout. They're often described as having a sagittal crest. That's the sort of cone shaped kind of point you'd see in large primates like gorillas and bigger orangutans. It's actually a bony ridge that runs down the middle of the skull that provides additional space for jaw muscles to be anchored to. So it's something you might expect and reasonably expect to find in a large primate. Usually described as being bipedal. That means kind of what they generally walk upright. Often described as having a strong odour, sometimes described as a wet dog, sometimes it's a sort of sulphurous, sort of rotten eggs kind of smell. And they leave large five-toed prints. These aren't just simply kind of big human prints. There's sometimes forensic detail that would imply that the foot sort of flexes in an unusable fashion, but they're quite distinctive. So where did this image actually come from? So in the beginning, you had legends from Native Americans, First Nations, who have beings, and most of them have beings in their culture that are kind of similar to Bigfoot. So, for instance, the Hoopa people of Northern California, they have a being called Oma, which translates roughly as boss of the wood or big man of the forest. It was a kind of large hairy giant but that they believed lived in the deep forest. Some of the cultures on Vancouver Island have the Sonaquah, the wild woman of the woods. When you see the kind of totem poles and the masks that they use for their dances, it does looks kind of simian. Does look kind of surprisingly ape-like for a continent where apes don't officially exist. Um, most cultures they have something similar to Bigfoot, but not necessarily that would translate 100% to them. But for some tribes, they believe that, or some cultures rather, believe that they're just simply another tribe of people who maybe live a more simpler life. Others, they're regarded more like nature spirits. Some cultures, it's somewhere in between, and that kind of beings that sort of walk in two worlds, sort of liminal creature between the real kind of natural world and the spirit world. And then as colonisation begins, European settlers would begin to report encounters with similar beings in the woods. So you can see like newspaper reports for the 1800s that will talk about wild men. And later on, as you move into the early 20th century, there'd often be reports of gorillas. So from places like California, there'd be newspaper reports using language like gorillas to describe kind of hairy creatures that people had encountered in the woods. Theodore Roosevelt wrote a book in the early 20th century that encountered a lethal encounter with a large hairy being that killed a couple of trappers in the Bitterroot Mountains in, I think it's is it Montana or Utah, Montana or Idaho. So there wasn't necessarily a common language to discuss these beings or these experiences, but certainly they're there when you dig back through the kind of old newspaper reports and sometimes like old settlers' accounts and folklore and so on. So you sometimes hear the term Sasquatch being bandied around as being an Indian word or a Native American word. It's not actually. It actually dates from the 1920s. It was coined by a J.W. Burns, who's an Indian agent on a reservation in British Columbia. He collected various folk tales from the Chehalis Indians regarding stories he had of hairy giants who lived in the mountains or the forest. When you look at these accounts now, they do seem to be describing something that's basically a person. They would often allegedly would snatch women for wives, and they were noted to speak a branch of the Douglas dialect. So they would actually speak to people. They were like a fire. They would gather on certain mountains. So it's a bit different to what we think of Bigfoot now. But the term Sasquatch is an anglicised version of various terms like Sasquatch, Sasquattle. There are various words used among different sort of Canadian First Nations to talk about these hairy giants. The term Bigfoot came about in 1958 from the Humboldt County Times in a newspaper report about it was loggers building a road in around about Bluff Creek. They were discovering large footprints around their machinery at night, and allegedly the machinery had been damaged or interfered with during the night. Jerry Cruz, who was their foreman, he cast a number of these footprints and took them to the local paper, and a reporter there coined the term Bigfoot. So that's a term that's kind of stuck, particularly for the American for the American creature. For better or worse, it does. It's not the best term. It's kind of goofy. Also implies that there's only maybe one creature. So other people have tried to use other terms for it, like wood ape. But unfortunately, these more conservative terms haven't really stuck. So for better or worse, we're kind of stuck with the term Bigfoot. If I'm going to use the term for the talk about Bigfoot, I'm just using that as the sort of standard creature of the Pacific Northwest. Whether we want to talk about other creatures. So in 1967, the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were two Bigfoot researchers who were in the Bluff Creek area filming a documentary in October 1967. And one day they rounded a bend on the river and managed to shoot a few seconds of a creature striding away from them. The film remains controversial to this day. There's been various conflicting analysis of it. Some people say that the way the creature moves, there's no way it could possibly be a person. Other analysis have said this is well within human range. It depends what size, what speed the film's viewed at. There's various people. There's been at least 3 competing claims to be the person in the suit. So any claims to that's been solved haven't really held up. Nobody's ever come forward with a suit, any kind of outtakes, any things you might expect from if the film had been faked. One of the people, the main Bob Herodotus, who's the person that's had the most attention as being one of the alleged person in the suit, he couldn't even identify the filming site. He didn't even really seem to know where it had been filmed. So certainly the jury's still out. By the same token, by the fact it's never been proved to be a fake, it's never been proved to be real either. Nobody's ever come up with a bit of footage sort of similar to this. Well, it's a singular piece of footage in that nobody's ever produced another piece that looks like a real creature. However, when you look at other fakes, nobody else has produced a bit of footage of the same kind of quality. One of the guys, again, Bob Herodotus, one of the guys who was alleged to be in the suit, took part in a BBC reconstruction. I think it was in the 1990s or late 90s, early 2000s, and even with BBC budget, the bit of footage that was produced looked nothing like the original. It was really blatantly a guy in a suit. So for better or worse, this has really shaped people's image of what they think a Bigfoot is, so whether or not it's actually a real piece of footage or not. So by this time, the image of Bigfoot as a sort of large cone-headed ape was kind of stuck, sort of cemented into people's sort of consciousness. But by the kind of late 60s, early 70s, there was a number of researchers who were beginning to identify that there was a lot of reports on records of creatures that sound a bit like Bigfoot, but in the sense of being an unknown primate, but probably actually aren't Bigfoot themselves. So this is what I'm really going to look at tonight. So first, these creatures I'm going to look at is the devil monkey. Now, the term's coined by Lauren Coleman and Mark Lyall. These are two cryptozoologists who have been probably some of the most active in identifying other forms of unknown primate. Lauren Coleman's actually written a couple of books that goes into this in some depth, which are some of the works I've consulted for this talk. So if you're interested in finding out more, I'd recommend Lauren Coleman's Field Guide to Bigfoot and Other Unknown Primates, and also his book Mysterious America, which does also cover a lot of this similar kind of ground. So devil monkeys they're sort of monkey-like creatures described as 4 to 6 foot tall, barrel chests, thick arms, powerful back legs. Described having tails, which is not that common in unknown primate sightings. So this is one of the things that would sort of really kind of marks them out as being a bit different. And also described having pointed ears. So again, the ears aren't often described in sort of conventional Bigfoot reports. One of the other sort of diagnostic things that marks out as being a bit different is they describe having a baboon or dog-like face. Baboons were often described as sort of dog-headed men in medieval Africa, or reports from Africa in medieval times. They're also described as leaving 3-toed footprints, which is a bit problematic because most primates, well, all known primates have 5 toes. So that's kind of unusual. So maybe would suggest that these are possibly not actually primates, or an unusually evolved form of primate. They're aggressive towards people and livestock, so they've been known to attack dogs, chase cars, kill livestock. So they're often, and again, another unusual feature on described as having a kangaroo-like hopping movement. And they're quite often reported from the eastern USA, particularly the Appalachian Mountains, although there are reports from right across North America, including 1 or 2 from as far away as British Columbia, but generally the sort of general Appalachian area. So to give you some sample sightings, first we'll talk about Saltsville creature. So Saltsville's in Western Virginia. So this is, if you see the map here, you can see there's quite a lot of large forest area. So it's quite a rural area, even though the state of Virginia itself has quite a lot, or it's quite heavily settled, particularly the kind of eastern part. But you do have parts with mountains and large forests. So 1959, Paulette Boyd is actually a local folklorist, used to run a website that collected Virginia ghost stories and folk tales. She recounted a story her parents told of in 1959. They encountered a strange creature very early in the morning. Her parents ran a kind of catering business, and they would have to get up early sometimes to buy ice, and they were on the road around 3-4 a.m. one morning when they encountered a strange creature. They described it as having light taffy coloured hair. It stood on 2 well-muscled back legs, had shorter front arms. The creature chased the car, which managed to keep up with it, grasping for it with its front paws. I believe they drove away once they lost it. Her dad had to be persuaded not to drive back with a gun to try to shoot it. So a few days later, a pair of nurses in a car were attacked by the same creature and had its convertible roof torn off. So there was a posse sent out to hunt for it, but they couldn't find it. The dogs had picked up a scent but refused to follow it. So a similar creature chased a car in the same area in 1973, and then there was a similar creature seen again in the late 90s, this time having grey fur, so some people can imply this might have been the same creature but much older. And again, it's described as having kangaroo-like rear legs with much shorter front legs. So again, this is something that doesn't sound like a conventional Bigfoot and sounds very different to the usual kind of reports. So again, you give another encounter. This one's from Michigan. It was recounted to the researcher Linda Godfrey in her book Hunting the American Werewolf. Linda Godfrey is a cryptozoologist who's generally documented dogman sightings. That is upright kind of bipedal canids, which we'll come back to in a second. But her books document all kinds of cryptids, quite often from standard Bigfoots to things that are much weirder. She just usually just sort of recounts the stories without really getting into advocating for one position or another as to what the creatures actually are. So this story, it's undated account. It came from a Jeff Cornelius who was working as a repo man. That's somebody that basically steals back cars from people that fall behind on hire purchases. And he attempted to retrieve a vehicle from a rural property in the vicinity of Holly, Michigan. So again, you can see from the map, quite a rural area. There's quite a lot of state parks, quite a lot of forests in the area. So while he was on this property, he encountered a 5.5 foot tall, brindle-coloured creature with a baboon-like face, described it having a hyena-like body and the rear legs being bent backwards. That kind of implies a kind of kangaroo-like legs. So the creature charged at him, they beat a hasty retreat to his truck and refused to return, much to the amusement or the disbelief of his colleagues. So the thing with devil monkeys is they do blend into a couple other cryptids. It can be difficult to decide where one report one report begins and another ends, or in terms of the classification. So one of the cryptids that they could be confused with are mystery kangaroos. So all over North America, you get reports of kangaroo-like creatures. Now these are quite possibly just escaped pets or escaped zoo animals or so on. The photo here is actually probably staged with a stuffed wallaby from a museum. But quite often these are just possibly known animals that are simply out of place. However, some of the behaviour ascribed to them doesn't sound like normal kangaroos, like attacking livestock and so on. So has led some people to speculate that some of these mystery kangaroo reports are in fact confused with devil monkeys. The other creature that they seem to blend into is dogmen, which are reports of upright canids. So these simply seem to be either large dogs or wolves that seem to walk upright, and these were not that well known up until maybe the mid-2000s when Linda Godfrey, who I mentioned previously, started documenting them. With her first book, the book Beast of Bray Road, and she's written a series of books afterwards. So what this then leads to sort of confusion of, well, how do you decide what's a dogman, what's a devil monkey, what's a Bigfoot? So this is a problem I'm going to come back to. We do have these sort of fuzzy categories, but how do you decide how do you classify things just based on a fleeting eyewitness sighting? So it also leads to the account how reports are classified can often just come down to who it's reported to. So if it goes to somebody with interest in, say you have a sighting of a dog-like cryptid, if it goes to somebody with an interest in dogmen sightings, they might classify it as that. If it's picked up by somebody who's maybe more a Bigfoot researcher, they might try and shoehorn it into the unknown primate category. So again, this is a problem I'm going to come back to later. So the very little in the way of physical evidence for them. There is this photograph, which is a Derrida roadkill photo, which is was taken in 1996 by somebody called Barbara Mullins. She discovered this carcass by the side of the road near Derrida in Louisiana. She thought it was a baboon-like creature. You don't really get a sense of this in the picture, but she thought that the paws actually look more like hands. There are a series of photos, but all the other ones seem to be thumbnails. So if you're interested, if you Google this, you'll be able to find the other photos there. So she described the size of an adult St Bernard's with thick dark brown hair and ape-like feet. So she took a series of photos, but when she returned back later to see if she could uplift the body, it was gone. As I say, she thought it was a baboon, but Other people suggested this could be a devil monkey. Others have suggested because it was the mid-90s, it was a chupacabra. I believe somebody else has suggested it's a loup-garou, which is the Louisiana version of a werewolf. In actual fact, I suspect it's probably just a dog, probably a chow. Although the official wildlife explanation was that it was a Pomeranian, which appears to be bigger. When you see, there's one of the photos, you can see a person standing in the background. It does look like it's a fair size. So I think a Pomeranian is unlikely. Other people have suggested some kind of rodent. I think it does look, when you see if you see the photo with the person in the background, I don't think it's too large for that. There are a couple other photos, one of which I think is pareidolia, the other is blatantly just a domestic dog, so I've not bothered including these. So yeah, but beyond that, there's not a lot in the way of physical evidence for this creature. So next, I'm going to move on to what we might term North American apes. So these are sort of smaller, sort of 45 foot tall, dark or red coloured creatures, often compared to chimps or orangutans. They can leave footprints with a diverged big toe, similar to known grey apes. So if you see the footprints, you'll say like a chimp, the thumb will be diverged off like the toe will be diverged off like a thumb. That's known as a hallux, and that's used to help we gripping when they're climbing. So most commonly reported for the southeast, such as Florida, Texas, and so on, but they are also known from the Midwest, and that's because there's a large extent of bottomlands and also swamps in these areas. There is a sort of a belt that extends up from the south where these creatures are reported from. So sometimes known as napes, which is again another more common term, which is a contraction of North American apes, skunk apes because of the smell, woolly boogers, which is a sort of traditional sort of southern name for any kind of mysterious ape-like creature. They're reported to swim, which is something that the sort of standard Bigfoot has been alleged to do as well, which is something that known grey apes don't actually do. And they sometimes walk upright, but also known a knuckle walk. That is walk on all fours. Again, and chimps and gorillas and so on will do this as well. So to give a sample sighting, this is Glenn Benton of satanic death metal band Deicide. He had his own encounter with a skunk ape in Florida. So I see this big fucking thing lurching down the side of the road. It's a grey thing. It clears the road at one fucking leap, roar into the woods. Glenn describes following the creature into the woods in his jeep. Things snapping down trees left and right. All around a smell like the inside of a dumpster. This thing looked like a primate of some sort. Huge eyes, but part orangutan and part chimp. After calling Florida wildlife, the area was checked and tracks are said to have been found. This account comes from an interview in the music magazine Terrorizer from the late 2000s, 2009 I think it was. So you can see some sort of standard accounts that come in. The fact that creature's more ape-like, and the sort of foul smell. So not necessarily the most credible witness, but in actual fact this report is fairly run-of-the-mill. It's fairly standard for the area. So again, not a huge amount of physical evidence for them in terms of DNA, and probably Bigfoot, so footprints and so on, but there is this photograph which is quite interesting. So this is a Miyaka skunk ape photograph. So these two photos were anonymously sent to the Saratoga Sheriff Department December 2000, along with a covering letter explaining where they'd come from. So the anonymous writer described a number of visits to their garden by a creature they thought had been orangutan, which he thought might be an escaped pet or zoo animal. So the creature took apples from the person's porch over a number of nights, and they were able to obtain a couple of photos of it, but the creature stopped visiting after they put a dog into the yard. So the explanations for this range from it being a skunk ape or an actual orangutan, whether that could either be a stage photo from a wildlife park, a park where there was a wildlife park with orangutan just in the general area, or an actual genuine feral orangutan that did actually appear in the person's garden. Could be a cardboard. There's been a suggestion it's a cardboard cutout because of the fact the image looks kind of flat. Although this might just be an artifact. So a lot of the images that are circulating are scans, so there may have been some flattening of the image occur over the years. Or that staged by a person or that could just be a complete fake staged by a person in a suit. So the letter writer's never been identified. However, there was some serial numbers on the back of the photos that they were able to confirm had been developed in the local area. So if it's a hoax, it's been a locally based one, but it could well be a real orangutan, but we don't know the circumstances which take him. And at this remove, we'll never really be able to prove one way or the other. So moving on, it's such a generic kind of term now for a littlefoot. So basically here we're just talking about a small, more human-like hairy race. So they're common in Native American folklore. The Crow Nation call them the Rumbi, the Nez Perce call them Itsiyaha, and the Delaware call them the Pukwudgie. So they're usually described as being short, pot-bellied with sharp teeth. Often described as using bow and arrows and have use of fire, so that's kind of unusual in that most of these other creatures, including the sort of standard Bigfoot, it's very rare for this tool used to be described. And they're usually ill disposed towards humans and may play pranks. So they maybe fit a bit more towards the Northern European concept of little people, goblins, brownies, and so on. And they're often described supernatural powers like shape-shifting. So this is maybe something that takes a bit more, leans a bit towards or folklore rather than a zoological reality. Having said that, there are a few sightings from today. So if you've never read this book, In the Valleys of Noble Beyond, I highly recommend it. It came out last year. John Zada's a travel journalist, and he wrote he spent a while with the First Nations people of the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia discussing their belief in Bigfoot. So the book mainly focuses on that, but also describes the environmental crisis in the area, the treatment of the First Nations in Canada and so on. So I really, really recommend it, regardless of your personal beliefs on Bigfoot. He takes quite a neutral approach to it and has some interesting experiences. So in this, he discovers a set of small human-like tracks by a remote lake in the Great Bear Rainforest, and the local First Nations people insist that people are unlikely to go barefoot in that area. So there's two sets, one broader but another really unusually narrow with a pointed heel, and that's the pointed heel is something that comes up quite frequently with regards to footprints of these smaller creatures. So the locals believe that there's two separate Sasquatch species in the area, one large and one small, with different tracks and have different vocalisations. Give another modern day account. This was the little man in Bridgewater Triangle. In 1990, while walking his dog on the fringes of the Hockomock Swamp in Massachusetts, Bill Russo encountered a strange creature. He described it as 3 to 4 foot tall. It was hairy, with a pot belly, with eyes too big for its head, almost like an owl. Although the creature was small, he actually felt it was old. So it beckoned to him while making a noise that sounded like Iwachu, and he just kept repeating this Iwachu over and over again. So his dog was frightened by the encounter, so the dog was reacting to whatever was there. And he tried to speak to the creature, but just kept repeating Iwachu to everything that was he tried to say to it. Later on, he decided that it was saying that Iwachu is actually the creature was saying "we want you," which is kind of sinister. So the Hockomock Swamp's part of the Bridgewater Triangle, which is an area in Massachusetts that has a high number of strange events. So that's weird lights, other cryptids, including thunderbirds, bigger unknown primates, most sort of standard Bigfoot, strange disappearances, cult activity. So it's a wee bit quite a sort of sinister area. So moving on, last category we're going to look at what we might term hairy hominids. So these are around about 6 to 7 foot tall, maybe more human looking in terms of size and proportion. Face is sometimes covered with hair with only the eyes visible, and sometimes they'll be described as having glowing eyes. So the most commonly reported in the eastern USA, so particularly places like Pennsylvania, Maine, the sort of sort of northeast. And they're often described as being more aggressive than the kind of standard Bigfoot. And they're often more associated with high strangeness events, that is, other weird events like UFOs, animal mutilations, other cryptids. I believe there's been cases where they've been sighted in conjunction with like anomalous big cats and so on. There may be like a wave of UFO sightings, Men in Black in West Virginia around the time the Mothman sightings. There was also sightings of creatures like this. And they're sometimes known as marked hominids, which is due to their. Sometimes they're described as being piebald, and again, that's another term from Lauren Coleman or Mark Hall, and also sometimes known as Eastern Bigfoot. So, to give you an example of this type of creature, we're going to talk about Momo. The term Momo has been bandied about recently. It's some sort of internet creature, but this is a sort of hominid creature from the 1970s. If you look at this book here by Lyall Blackburn's a really great summary of it, so if you're interested in learning more, I'd recommend the book. But so July 1972, Louisiana, Missouri, two boys saw a creature described 7 foot tall, covered in black hair. So it had a strong odour, and they couldn't see its face as this face was covered in hair. It held a dead dog under its arm. Their neighbour had claimed earlier in the day that she'd heard a noise like animals fighting in the wood. And then spoke to a local farmer whose dog had went missing around about the same kind of time. So they would then follow a spate of sightings around the town for the course around about the next year or so. So as well as direct sightings of the creatures, people heard strange howls, smelled foul odours, stones were thrown by unknown assailants. There was strange footprints, sometimes described as having 3 toes. A number of dogs disappeared as well. Around about this kind of time, there was also a number of sightings of strange lights. Around a similar kind of time frame. So the creature was christened Momo, short for Missouri Monster. An armed posse searched for the creature but failed to find anything. And the sightings eventually tailed off. So sometimes for these kind of this Eastern Bigfoot or hairy hominids, whatever you want to call them, they will get a kind of flap of sightings, and you may have a bunch of sightings in a short time frame, and then the creature would disappear for a long time. Sometimes for good. Sometimes it may appear years later, which gives a suggestion: is it a flesh and blood creature? Is it some sort of social panic? But again, these are questions I'll come back to in a bit. So another example of this type of creature comes from The Creature: Personal Experiences with Bigfoot by Jan Clement. So it's a small press booklet originally published in 1975, recounting a series of encounters with hairy hominids in southwestern Pennsylvania. It was written under a pseudonym by a college professor. Apparently he was some kind of science lecturer at a local college. It's written under pseudonym for a variety of reasons, partly with the nature of the content of the book. But partly in the book he discloses that he'd been staying in a cabin in the wilderness because his wife had kicked him out following an affair with a student. So that's possibly why he was trying to remain anonymous. Why he would then write a book, I don't know, but anyway. But it's described repeated encounters with a creature described about 7 foot tall, covered in short brown hair, had powerful leg and shoulder muscles and a protruding stomach. It was proportioned like a human. His feet were 13 inches long. He describes comparing this to other Bigfoot footprint casts he's looked at and felt the creatures maybe slightly different. I also described as the hair growing down from its face, giving the impression of a mask. So again, this is something that comes up quite a lot with this type of creature, and that its face is completely covered in hair, whereas your kind of standard Bigfoot, if you like, is always described as looking like a gorilla, having a kind of hairless face with usually dark skin. So it seemed to turn up when the witness would be doing manual work, which he theorised was attracted by the smell of his sweat. And if it appeared in broad daylight, it'd shade its eyes, suggesting it was used to low light levels. So his theory was that it was a creature of the deep forest, or potentially maybe even staying in caves. So he began feeding it fruit and it would appear on a regular basis, and would often sit and allow it to observe it closely while it was feeding. It was afraid of manufactured objects, so if he produced a camera, it would disappear. It was also anything that could have maybe suggested like a weapon or anything like that that would make it disappear. So it's a really interesting account. Some parts of the description of the creature do match other reports. And bearing in mind this wasn't the introduction to the current version, because you can pick this up on Kindle. In the introduction, it claims that there was originally 400 copies printed, 100 were sold, and the rest went to landfill. So it was fairly obscure for quite a long time, but some of the details in it do match other reports. However, it does have a couple of particularly dubious aspects to it. One is an account where he claims that he was so concerned about hunters stumbling over the creature that they would shoot it. So he managed to relocate it 200 miles away by tricking it into the back of his station wagon, where it then kind of lay down like a dog for a journey about 200 miles, and then manage to journey back the 200 miles itself to reappear at his cabin the following day. So that's a bit dubious. He also claims that he caught it hanging out the back of a coup, but I'll not get into that. So that's some of the other mystery primates we have in North America. There's various other ones I've not really got into just for time. Like for instance, there's a more sort of giant variation, sometimes upwards of 13, 14 foot tall. There's alba twitches. They are like a Bigfoot-like creature from Pennsylvania, but are really, really thin. So just for time, I'm just going to keep it to those four. So we'll just look at some potential explanations. So the first is that we've got numerous species of unknown primates. Now that would explain the variation in the eyewitness reports. However, downside of that is one species unknown primate would be remarkable. Never mind 4, 5, possibly more. And bear in mind, we have no physical evidence for any of that. There's some interesting forensic evidence in terms of footprints and so on, but we don't have a body and we don't have any DNA. So another theory would just be that there's one unknown species but with regional variation. So as I say, you do get the sightings of the kind of standard Bigfoot across North America. It's been suggested that the ape-like ones are maybe juveniles. There's been some reports from Oklahoma where some Bigfoot researchers who have an area they've been studying for quite a long time. I've seen both in the sort of classic sort of large Bigfoot, the Pacific Northwest, or creatures similar to that, along with the more sort of chimp-like ones. And they theorise that the chimp-like ones are simply juveniles. It could well be that the things like, say, the skunk ape, with its shaggy ape-like appearance, is maybe more an adaptation to the swamps or bottomlands, as opposed to the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. So that's, again, so you're maybe just then reduced to maybe one unknown species. We a bit of variety, which potentially more plausible than 4 or 5. Having said that, none of these creatures are evolutionary impossible. They do look like things in the fossil records are not a huge remove from known primates. But it's not a question of much is could they exist, it's could they exist without leaving more physical evidence than we already have. Others, we misidentified indigenous species, so bears are, for instance, one of the things that people most likely confuse for Bigfoot, because they're large, they're furry, they walk upright for short distances. So certainly bears are definitely a factor, although I don't think they work in every single case, because there's been people claim they've seen the creature stepping over fences, which would be difficult for a bear to do upright. But certainly, definitely a factor. I think also it's been suggested for devil monkeys that's just simply known canids, like particularly say coyotes. Could be an explanation for that. Sometimes they will walk upright. And it's quite often a lot of the sighting areas where these creatures are sighted, they're coyotes in the area, but it's maybe not an area where they're maybe so well known. So it definitely that's probably definitely a factor. And misidentified introduced species. So for a lot of the more monkey or ape-like creatures, could just simply be known monkeys or apes that are either escaped pets, escaped lab animals. For instance, in I think it was the 1990s in Pennsylvania, there was a series of sightings of a creature which was described looking as like a chimp. This unfortunate creature was eventually shot, and some of the news reports initially said it was given to a local vet who couldn't identify it, which was true. But this vet then passed it to, I think it was the local university biology department, who then identified it as a macaque, and it actually had a tattoo. So it was presumably an escaped laboratory animal, or potentially somebody's pet. The various other stories that, for instance, that a group of macaques escaped from the set of a Tarzan film in the 1930s in the Everglades, and took up residence there. And some regions or some counties don't have particularly strict animal control laws, so it's possible that people keep exotic animals as pets, which will then potentially escape. So some of these reports are possibly known primates, but in an area where you wouldn't expect to encounter them. Hoaxes, again, definitely a factor, in terms of people just making up reports wholesale for their own amusement. Not financial gain, not particularly likely. But there's things like the case that was known as the Beltway Booger, creature known as the Beltway Booger, where somebody came forward to, it's a devil monkey like creature, but somebody came forward to confess that was them with a suit. Now, people do stick on suits for their own amusement. This kind of risky, because obviously in America, obviously a lot of people have guns. There was a case a few years ago, a guy sticking on a ghillie suit and running across the road, being hit by a car, and actually dying. So again, there are a factor, but I don't know to what extent. It's difficult to say what extent the hoaxes are actually a factor in this. Some people suggested that the unknown hominids are some kind of paranormal phenomena. That's down to the large number of sightings relative to the lack of bodies. People will often shoot at these creatures. They don't die. Somebody will shoot a creature point blank with a rifle, and the creature will just walk off unharmed, or the bullet will seem to pass through. And again, sometimes it's association with other sort of strange phenomena. Problem with this is you're then explaining one unknown with another unknown, and you could never really prove this. Final one to look at some sort of psychosocial phenomenon. Now that would be the idea that we're maybe hardwired to see these sort of creatures. Because if you look at it globally, you've got the Yeti, Yeren in China. In Australia, you've got the Yowie and the Jujundi, which is a smaller, more sort of folkloric Caribbean. You've got the orang pendek. So it's almost every continent has a creature like this. There's even sightings in Britain, even in the last few years of kind of recent times, of people encountering Bigfoot-like creatures in environments where they couldn't possibly exist. So it does then beg the question, are people almost kind of programmed to see these kind of creatures? Is there maybe some sort of external trigger that could induce this experience? So this is kind of interesting. It would explain the large number of sightings relative to the small amount of physical evidence. The only question with this really, suppose you could test it by trying to find a way to induce the experience in people. However, we then don't really have a mechanism to say how this could work, particularly when you have multiple witness encounters, which aren't really that unusual. Although we do have a small amount of physical evidence in terms of footprints that seem to have forensic evidence that suggests that it's been made by a real dynamic foot. It's not really any DNA evidence at the moment, or no bodies that have been put in front of a scientist. So yeah, I would lean towards the last one as possibly being the most likely, but I'm open to. It's quite possible that we're going to get in actual fact it's like a combination of any of these. So in conclusion then, so there's a lot of interest in eyewitness testimony, particularly in regards to the geographic distributions of sightings. So it is interesting that as you move further east, Bigfoot sightings seem to change slightly, particularly if you move south as well. there is some sort of geographical variations in what people are reporting. Not 100% because the kind of standard Bigfoot, if you like, is sort of seen right across North America, but it's interesting that devil monkeys are tend to be reported in one part of the country. You get skunk apes, the more ape-like creatures are more likely to be seen in the sort of southeast. So could there be cultural reasons for this? But a lot of times people aren't aware that Bigfoot are reported in this part of the country. People would be, they'll know the Bigfoot in the northwest, but they're unaware that they're maybe seen in the part of the country where they live. And there are instances of people who are like new immigrants to the country who are completely unaware of the Bigfoot phenomenon in general. So maybe sort of social or cultural explanations maybe don't hold, but at the same time we don't have any bodies or DNA. We can't really classify the creatures, so so it is a bit difficult to work off to put things into categories when you only really have kind of eyewitness testimony to go on. It's just partly because people are what they'll pick up on is quite subjective. They may focus on particular particular features of the being, so it's kind of difficult to make kind of form kind of categories, but you can sort of point out some sort of trends that are kind of interesting. But to date, we've never actually had a Bigfoot or any other kind of unknown primate. We've never actually had a body in front of a biologist or zoologist who can classify it. We don't necessarily need a body anymore. We have a good DNA sample. You would be able to say, well, okay, it's an unknown primate, but it's most closely related to an orangutan. But without that, we can't actually classify the creatures. So as I said earlier, none of these are evolutionary impossible, but we don't have any conclusive proof to say they definitely exist. One thing that does bother me though, we do have some contradictory behaviours. So some of these creatures are described as being aggressive, which would it's not a great survival strategy because other creatures that have been aggressive towards either humans or livestock haven't done well. So if you look at the fate of the grizzly bear for most of the Western America, the mountain lion, they generally drive them to extinction or back to the kind of deepest wilderness. So if these creatures existed and were really attacking people or chasing cars or killing livestock, you would expect more bodies to turn up. So until a body is obtained or we have DNA evidence, these creatures are often made part of the goblin universe rather than being categorised and classified among those species of the zoological world. So that's the end of this talk. If you've got any comments or queries, you can put them in the comments box below and I'll do my best to answer them. And thanks for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much for an interesting and informative talk there, Scott. Always a pleasure to listen to what you have to say about Bigfoot and his cousins. Next month, on Tuesday the 8th of September at 7:30, we've got a new speaker for the group, and that is Sharon Hill. Sharon is an American, and normally we wouldn't be able to get an American to come across and give us a talk, so taking advantage of these unusual times. Sharon will be talking on spooky geology. So, thank you everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed yourselves, and I hope to see you next month. Thanks very much. Bye now.